Welcome to the Teen Chicks Arts Podcast, also known as TAP, a Seattle-based youth podcast that focuses on empowering youth voices through the exploration of art. Here on this podcast, we share our favorite artistic influences by exploring their histories and cultural impacts, but not only by offering our perspective as teens. We frequently interview artists from aspiring youth creators to professionals from various Northwestern art scenes. I'm Blue.
I'm Mickey, and today we will discuss an interesting topic with a rich history, contemporary classical music. We will talk about its importance to us as artists, its significance in today's media, and why you should be interested in it. Then we'll get the exciting opportunity to discuss the topic with a professional composer and a young musician to get an understanding of its significance to today's teens.
So, Mickey, why did you choose this topic, and why is this an important artistic influence for you?
I think that it's really important to engage with unfamiliar art, especially for youth, because kind of with mass accessibility, it's kind of almost our duty in a way to explore what's out there past our comfort zone and past the reaches of our interests. It might kind of be unfamiliar or unenjoyable, which is kind of funny to say, but you don't know what's out there, and some of it might totally change the way you look at the world. Like for me, when I got into modern classical music, it's completely changed like how I create and how I think about art. And I think there's just a lot of potential for that goes unexploited because people think of experimental art as specifically experimental classical music or modern classical music as experimental or kind of dissonant to a point where you can't enjoy it. But I just personally think it's really important to remember that it is made to be enjoyed, and it's made to be kind of taken in and to inspire you and to make you think, which I think is that's what makes it really important to engage with, especially for youth, because we're going to be the next generation of artists.
I didn't really know much about modern classical music before you brought it up. It just isn't something that I normally gravitate towards, but I am a musician and I do love to learn about new music, or music that's new to me, not necessarily new. So I'm really glad that you brought it up because I'm also a filmmaker and I'm super interested in film scoring and music and its relationship to film. So I think it's and now I'm thinking about film scores that I already enjoy. I'm thinking about them in a different way, and I'm thinking about modern classical music in a whole different way because it's not something that I am super familiar with, but I've learned that I actually am kind of familiar with it as I've started to learn more about it.
Yeah, for people who don't know that much about it, modern classical music kind of developed in the early 20th centuries as composers began to experiment with new kinds of sounds that were unfamiliar to the listener. They kind of got tired of late romantic music, which was kind of exaggerated and very emotional. Over time, originally it was very experimental, and the things they were doing, they were breaking the rules and kind of making things up. People were banging on pots and pans, and it's like John Cage 4:33. It's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. It's people were getting very weird. But that musical vocabulary, like you said, in film, it's actually kind of been integrated and absorbed into our culture, and it's out there. If you look closely, it will be in places you don't think it will. So I think that's a really important thing to do if you want to get into it, is just look for it in the things you enjoy.
Yeah. That kind of leads into my next question, which is how is this music relevant today?
I think that it kind of ties into what I said about it kind of being our duty to kind of engage with it. But I also think that it bridges the gap between new and old. You can hear late romantic and classical and Baroque vocabulary in that music. You can hear how it started. You can hear classical music in it, but you can also hear these new conventions and these new things that people are doing. It is an expansion of classical music, which kind of makes it, it's very revolutionary. It feels like it really represents a strong musical future for me because it has the old, it has these things in it, and it understands and uses them to its advantage, but it also looks to the future and looks to new things that we can do and create. And I think that's just really important to understand and engage with.
Yeah, I think especially for people our age, I think when you think of classical music, it's you think of boring old stuff, and it's not something that most people our age are gonna want to listen to. I mean, obviously there's exceptions, but I think in the vast majority of teenagers are not listening to classical music all the time. But I think or at least they wouldn't think of themselves as listening to classical music all the time. But I think like when you really think about it, you're exposed to classical music like unconsciously in so many different places. And like I feel like it's been so influential to like everything. So like
yeah. Our entire culture.
Yeah. So I think it's like important to like think about that and to like broaden your perspective on classical music. And like we're living in a time where we can literally like listen to whatever we want whenever we want. So I think like you should just listen to more classical music.
Try new things.
Yeah. And I think we take it for granted a lot that like we have all this
Definitely.
music at our fingertips. So I think like you should use that to your advantage and like you should explore new things and like broaden your perspectives on things.
I totally agree.
Yeah. So we're gonna get into talking about some film scores, because like these are places that you probably have heard modern classical music, but you just like didn't know about it. Yeah. So one of my favorite composers is Angelo Badalamenti. And he composed a lot of music for most of David Lynch's projects, including Twin Peaks. He experiments with like blending jazz and classical music like super interestingly, and like it's really haunting and it really fits like the atmosphere of all of David Lynch's work so well. You probably have heard the Twin Peaks theme out in the world, and that's like it's just an amazing piece of music. Laura Palmer's theme, also from Twin Peaks, I think it really perfectly encapsulates like her character and like the sadness associated with her. And like I would also recommend, if you haven't, you should look up this video of Angelo talking about like how he developed the theme.
That's so cool.
With David
I love
Lynch.
That video.
And it's like really interesting, and I think it's like a really cool way to think about classical music. Yeah. Anything else to add about Angelo?
I just gotta say, I'm a big Angelo fan. I'm an Angelo head all the way.
Oh, for sure.
I love his scores. That
Yeah.
stuff is awesome.
Another one is Alexander Desplat. He composed a lot of scores for Wes Anderson movies, Greta Gerwig's Little Women, and the last two Harry Potter movies. I really love his scores for Wes Anderson's films. I think they capture like the whimsical vibe and nature of his films really well. He composed the music for Fantastic Mr. Fox, which is one of my favorites. You probably have heard Mr. Fox in the Fields. That's like the main theme from that movie. And then another composer that Mickey's a big fan of is Colin Stetson. He composed, among many other things, he composed the soundtracks for Hereditary and The Menu. I'm a really big fan of the Hereditary soundtrack. I think it's like, it's very experimental and it's very, very creepy, but it's like so beautiful at the same time. And I think it's like gives a good contrast to the film, because the film is like really creepy.
It's
if you've
really
seen it, you
creepy.
know.
It's
a really creepy movie. But all the music is like, it's very creepy as well, but like it's also so beautiful and so like haunting and so interesting to listen to in the context of the film and outside of it.
The music is in stark contrast to the subject matter of the film.
Yes.
Which is really, it's jolting, but it totally works. It's really interesting. Colin Stetson. Check out Colin Stetson, because Colin Stetson is amazing. I could rant about Colin Stetson for an entire episode.
Yeah.
I saw him live.
Yeah,
That was
super
sick.
cool.
He's a really great.
That's super cool.
But yeah, on to the next thing. What were you saying?
Well, I was just gonna say that my favorite track from the Hereditary soundtrack is this song called Reborn. And it plays in like one of the final scenes of the film.
The final scene.
Is it the final scene?
I think it's
the final scene then. I think there's like one more song on the end of the soundtrack, but whatever.
Probably.
Anyways, it's like the final scene and it's like the climax of the film, and all of it has been building up, and it's such a beautiful song. It's so good. Like I was watching the movie for the first time and I was like, what is this song? This song is so good.
Happening?
Cause like I was like, I mean, I wasn't taken out of the film, but I was like kind of taken out of it in a good way, because I was like, oh my God, this song is so good.
It's like really interesting that, like I said, like the emotional dissonance.
Yeah.
Like it's weird. It creates a really weird effect. You should totally check it out.
Yeah. Now we're going to interview some artists familiar with the world of modern classical music, and they're going to share their experiences with it and how it has been influential in their art.
So, Angelique Poteet is a native of the Pacific Northwest, and many of her works are inspired by the natural beauty of the region. Her music has been described as engaging, restless, New York Times, serious, and nicely crafted, American Record Guide, and extremely accomplished and vividly picturesque, Seattle Times. Receiving performances on 4 continents by ensembles including the Seattle Symphony Orchestra, Arcs Percussion Duo, Emerald City Music, Cernabella, and Trio Claviola. So, how does modern classical music influence your work and kind of what inspires you to create?
Well, as a contemporary classical composer, I write modern classical music, right? And I think that we're in a really interesting time that if you listen to music by, say, for example, Beethoven, and you listen to all of his contemporaries, there are these elements of tonality or the system of how they organize music that kind of sounds very similar. And we don't really have a lot of that right now. So it's like this really wonderful moment of freedom that we have in contemporary music. So we can do things that are maybe gritty, that are inspired by sounds that we hear out in nature, more than just, a violin doing trills to mimic a bird, something a little bit more creative than that. But you can also play off of people's expectations of what classical music maybe is supposed to sound like versus like harmony, melody, these ideas to tie it into this whole strange narrative of whatever is inspiring. So how does modern classical music inspire me? I think because everything is so different, you go and you listen to a piece by one composer who is writing music today, and it sounds completely different than music by another composer who's also writing music today. They're completely different. I think it's really neat to hear different perspectives, to hear how people approach using instruments, reflecting off of modern day occurrences that are happening in the world around us. Geopolitical events or what's happening with the planet or any of these things. These are all things that people are writing about, which is, I think, really exciting. It's like listening to a story, except it's very abstract. So, everyone's take on it is totally different, which is also really cool.
There's a lot more room for experimentation and kind of a
Yes.
lot more tools that you can use to craft a stronger sense of like narrative. It's
Right.
really interesting to see like a lot of my favorite works of contemporary classical music have like a very distinct subject matter. Like WTC by Steve Reich is like just straight up, it's about 9/11, and it's like you can hear it in the sound. It's like, it's really interesting how it feels like a lot of the contemporary techniques that have developed over time allow for this interesting sense of storytelling. And that also ties into what you're talking about, activism and being able to kind of talk about the world itself through music.
Right.
It's very interesting. I've listened to some of your music and I've read a little about it, and a lot of it is inspired by the problems in the world, and like seems like it's kind of trying to inspire change. Like, what's it called? The one about global warming.
I have lots of them that have kind of been influenced by that, but Dear Humanity would be the most recent one.
That's it.
Yes.
That was really interesting. I listened to some of that, and it was really beautiful.
Thank you.
How did you use the techniques of modern classical music to kind of get that point across and tell that story?
Dear Humanity was a really interesting project because that's a piece that I actually co-wrote with about 30 teenagers who didn't have a lot of experience writing music. They kind of approached it cold. What they all had in common was that they liked to sing. And we wanted to create a piece together for orchestra that utilized voices and amplified issues that were important to them. And we had this whole project where we came up with these outlines and we tried to identify what's some common grounds that everyone's concerned about or what they want to talk about. And this could be a piece of fiction if we wanted to create some fiction story, or this could be something influenced by what's happening in the real world. And we ended up centering on climate change as something that was on everyone's mind. Like, we feel really passionately about this. And I was, of course, thrilled because it's something that I think about a lot as someone who grew up in the Pacific Northwest and loves living in a beautiful place and wants it to stay that way. So working together to come up with text, and of course, when you're creating music with text, then that makes it a little bit easier, I think, to really get your point across because people have that to relate to. But being able to utilize the music to really enhance that text was the fun part of that project. And the students came up with all of the main melodic material. And that was like, we had these sessions where like, well, let's talk about how do we come up with melodies? And is there a way that we can utilize speaking and the natural inflection of our voice as we're saying things to help inspire coming up with melodic shapes? Because the way that we talk, we don't just talk in monotone all the time in a similar rhythm that doesn't, it's boring. So using that as kind of a launching point for, okay, how can we create these melodies that complement the text, and then figure out how to use the orchestra to really bring everything to in full color. We're beyond the days of Technicolor, but I'm going to use that term anyway, just because it's fun. There was definitely a lot of like sitting down and coming up with harmonies and thinking, okay, instead of what is the function of this harmony, like from a standpoint of this needs to go to this to serve this resolution tendency, what if we think about, does this harmony feel like it's angsty, or does it feel optimistic? Is it really clashy and dark? And just coming up with all these descriptors of how these combinations of notes made us feel, and then using that as like a way of building the foundation to support these melodies. And it was really fun. We did have a couple of interesting techniques, like the trumpets blow on their mouthpieces and they create these sirens. That was really fun, which is kind of like everything's on fire siren, like a fire truck. Cool. Or we have the strings that are doing these very brittle kind of sul ponticello spidery noises to mimic going through this forest where the trees match our skeletons. And so these are all like fun things that we can do with orchestration and instruments to really heighten this sense. And it was a really powerful experience working with them and having them really feel ownership of this work and have it performed by such an incredible group like the Seattle Symphony, and then with students singing it. And that was a really, really neat project.
That is really cool. The imitation is really interesting. That's a tool I see used a lot in a lot of contemporary classical music, like use of the human voice, like vocal rhythms and melody.
Yeah,
is like because you're able to move outside of the traditional techniques of the instrumentation and the orchestration. You're able to create these really interesting, like, it's almost like bridging the definition of music. It's like becoming something else. That's really interesting. Well, you talked about working with youth. That's something that we're really dedicated to, is specifically this is about youth accessibility to modern classical music. And something that we've thought about a lot is it feels kind of hard to get into, like
contemporary classical music,
or the experimentalness of it. I feel like it's kind of gained this reputation of difficult to enjoy. It's like, would you agree?
No.
Really?
I mean, I think, maybe it's just because that's my life is contemporary music. I think maybe if you go into it expecting some music that you can sit down to and have in the background while you're eating dinner or having a conversation and just kind of tune out, then you're going to have a difficult time enjoying it. Because I find that most contemporary music really demands your attention.
Yeah, I agree.
You need to pay attention, and hearing it live, I think, is a good way, like, to get into it. If you don't have a lot of experience listening to contemporary music, just seeing how the performers are doing what they're doing. Because if you're there and you hear this noise that maybe is is something that you're not sure you like. It could be a little bit abrasive, but you see that it's coming from an instrument that you didn't expect it to be coming from, or it's requiring some kind of technique of like drawing an item across the head of a bass drum or something to get this really eerie sound. Then all of a sudden it's like, wow, the way that these sounds are created is really cool. But also, I think approaching it from the standpoint of really opening your ears, opening up the sense of I'm here to experience whatever I experience, and maybe the sounds that I hear will put me on edge, or maybe the sounds that I hear will get me excited and optimistic. But the point is to hear them and to experience whatever you experience personally, and to be inspired by that, to be inspired to have conversations about what you heard. What was cool, what was something that, maybe you might need to listen to another time before you're like, yeah, okay, maybe. And that's okay. Like, I mean, if I go and I listen to an early Tchaikovsky symphony, maybe I'm kind of like, well, that's kind of boring. I mean, just because it's written by Tchaikovsky doesn't mean it's going to be my favorite piece, right? And I think that that's the case with contemporary music too. But just kind of approaching it with an open mind and being ready to experience.
Yeah. I think that some of the extended techniques and the ideas around it allows for a lot more emotional expression.
Yes,
I'd say.
absolutely.
And not all of those emotions are positive.
Mm-hmm.
There's like pain and discomfort in it. And I think that's why, like you said, you really need to engage with it. It's not just, you can't just tune out to it.
Right.
Because sometimes it'll be scary or frightening or painful. That's one of my favorite parts about it, is it's able to express these really colorful emotions that I really have a hard time finding in other places, because the extended techniques and the concepts in it just allow for this kind of musical freedom that feels really unique to it. It's really interesting. So what is your experience kind of playing and composing modern classical music? I mean, that's kind of an interesting question to ask,
right,
because, you are a contemporary classical musician, but what are some examples of your best work or your most favorite experiences?
As for me actually writing, let me see, things that I'm really excited about. I do have a piece. I sent you an excerpt of it from... it's actually, I'm really excited. I have an album of my compositions that's coming out.
Is that 6 Seasons?
6 Seasons, yeah.
I listened to a little bit of that.
Yeah. So the excerpt that I sent you is from a piece called Fluid Dovetail, and that's on the album. It's for clarinet and viola, and that was the first piece that I wrote during the pandemic. I'd started writing the piece just a little before, and then the pandemic hit, and I decided to use the music that I'd written before, which was like this idea of clarinet and viola are the same range. So I have them playing in unison, and then how do I kind of play off that? And all of a sudden it became, okay, well, if we've got people rehearsing in Zoom where they're listening, but they have latency issues and they can't play together, how do I write something that they can still play on Zoom and they don't have to be together in order to get the sense of togetherness? So it's intentionally a little offset, a little vague, the rhythm's not specifically notated. And so the first like several minutes of the piece is this kind of listening and reacting and taking time, and it's very free and just kind of like, okay, we get this sense of what we're working toward, this optimism of what we'll have when we can get back together. And then the second part of the piece is all this, okay, now it's intentionally offset to create these really fun syncopations, which then eventually get together to this unison that I wrote before the pandemic. And then it becomes this kind of rock and roll ruckus thing. So I sent you a little excerpt, which is this trade-off of I think maybe one of the more popular music influence sections. And I say popular music, like a lot of contemporary composers are influenced by popular music, like rock and roll or pop or R&B, any of those. For me, it's rock and roll, jazz, Latin music. So there is a little bit of that influence. And so you have the clarinet that kind of plays this baseline foundation for it, and then they switch, and then the viola all of a sudden becomes that bass line, but it's really, really virtuosic. Just a lot of double stops, and then the clarinet plays this kind of crazy improvised sounding melody on top of that.
That's really interesting. So you took the like zoom latency and like used it in your music.
Yeah.
See, like that's what I'm talking about. Is it's like you wouldn't be able to do that in a traditional classic setting. Like that's really cool. That is interesting.
Well, and that's what I really like about contemporary music is that it is contemporary. It's inspired by contemporary events. And I mean, there's a lot of music that is inspired by the pandemic. I mean, you just have to go out there and look for it. And the take is totally different for every composer. The things that they're inspired by or how they express what the pandemic meant to them or what it meant to their community. So yeah, for me, I liked the sense of trying to work toward being together, even if you're not.
That's really cool. That's really interesting. It's like, it's just being able to express and paint that experience in such a vivid way is just, that's really cool to me. So what do you think are some opportunities to engage with or kind of get into contemporary classical music in the Seattle area?
In the Seattle area, I would say Seattle Modern Orchestra is a good place to start. They only play classical music. I know there's some other groups. The Sound Ensemble, they do a lot of contemporary music. Seattle Symphony, they usually try to program at least one contemporary piece on every program. And I know they usually do things with Teen Tix too, at least for some of their programs. But just kind of look and see what's out there. And then if you can't make it out to catch live performance, you can catch a lot of contemporary music just in film, video games, stuff like that. That's a good place to kind of dip your toes in. And then maybe you're like, wow, I really like this kind of scratchy violin thing. Maybe I can listen to some other scratchy violin stuff. And it's really easy to find, especially like in the days of Spotify and YouTube. And I don't know, I'm a dinosaur. I like YouTube. It's really easy to like look things up and find it. So there are a lot of really, really exciting composers out there that you can find online, and then just hopefully catch some live performances in the area, because there's live music happening all the time.
Oh yeah. At least now after the pandemic. Yeah.
Yes, thank goodness.
Yeah. It's kind of weird. We had like a little place where it all stopped and then it kind of came back, which is cool. But yeah, I think that's true, especially online. Like I talk about that a little in the episode. It's with the mass accessibility of music. It's kind of, I feel like it's almost our like duty to kind of go outside our comfort zone.
Oh, absolutely.
Because there's stuff you might, love or totally change how you see the world that's out there and you might not know. So I think it's important to, move outside your comfort zone and explore the boundaries of what you think sounds good.
Yeah.
And be open to listening to some unpleasant noises.
Right. And I mean, we're no longer in a era where we have a cassette tape that's 45 minutes long that we just play until it wears out because, we don't have anything else in our car, right? You can set up a playlist of music from everything, right? And listen to new music all the time. So that's what I think is important, to just listen and to try new things, to listen, stretch your ears, maybe push them in a little uncomfortable area. And then that will also change how you listen to music that's maybe more comfortable, or music that maybe you are very familiar with. And then you hear something new and you're like, oh, okay, well, the way I think about this piece isn't the same anymore.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
I would agree. Well, I think that's good. Thanks so much for joining us. I think that was really interesting and insightful. I think that getting to hear kind of your perspective on it from kind of someone who actually has worked in the genre. And how long have you worked in it?
Well, let's see. I've been writing music for almost 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Someone with 30 years of experience behind them to give us some insights on, what makes it interesting and how to get into it. I think that was really interesting. Thanks so much for joining us. That was really cool.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Intro on Blues Guest. 3, 2, 1.
Our next interviewee is a youth composer named August Beck. Born in Seattle, Washington, and currently residing in Boston, August attends the New England Conservatory of Music, studying with Stephen Drury. August uses music for dialogue with himself and the world. He believes that music is a unifier of different cultures, religions, politics, and histories. His compositions have been performed by the Seattle Symphony.
Camera 1 is rolling. Ready, blue, in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, hi. I'm excited to talk to you. Okay, so, oh my god, wait, it won't let me minimize it. No. Okay, never mind, got it. Okay, cool. Nice to see you. So I have a few questions for you. The first one is, how did you get into modern classical music, and how is it important to you and your art?
I started getting into modern classical music, I think, from my piano performance. I'm a pianist right now at the New England Conservatory of Music, and it's been something I've been a part of my life since I was 7. And I've always had opportunities to perform modern classical music, modern music. And I've always found it to be a great reflection, just like any other classical music is, of present, addressing present conflicts maybe, and providing a reprieve from modern life. I think some modern music especially is really can sometimes reflect peace or can reflect chaos. I find that very appealing.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah. Okay, so how do you think that like modern classical music is important today, like especially like to teens and like youth and like exploring new types of music?
I think modern classical music, I mean, I think it's can be kind of intimidating, just because classical music itself has a sense of decorum that might make people afraid to approach it. But I think what's nice about modern music now is that there's a lot more opportunities for diversity in voices. I think classical music, as great as these composers are, they reflected a very Eurocentric view of what music could be. And I see right now, and what I'm trying to achieve with my music is that I can reflect audiences better, and performers. And so I think that lends itself to maybe having more younger audience members being more interested in hearing things that reflect what's going on in their life.
Yeah, definitely. I think like it's like kind of hard to like get into classical music, especially because like most of the classical music that you like might think of when you think of classical music is like super old and like not like something that like probably youth want to connect with. But I think also like the world has more classical music than like that, like classical music that like people our age might enjoy more like than we imagine. But I think it's just like kind of like the process of getting into that is like difficult, because like when you think of classical music you probably don't think of like something like exciting and that you would like want to listen to, but like I think it's a lot broader than one might imagine.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think for someone to, whenever someone says, oh, I find classical music to be so boring, I really just tell them to go out and maybe try to experience a live classical music concert, because those experiences are really transformative. And through there, I think that's what contemporary classical music might, like, I see this really interesting concert. I wouldn't go to the symphony usually, but because I see this, young composer doing something crazy, then I want to go to the symphony hall. And it can even be like film scores. I don't know if you're familiar with like Studio Ghibli.
Yeah, definitely I am.
Yeah, I mean, that was a huge concert series for this Seattle Symphony recently, and
Yeah.
that's just great ways to get more people into the concert halls and kind of break down these ideas that classical music is restrictive or hard to get into.
Yeah, I think definitely like film scores and like video game music a lot is like kind of like the way to get like young people more into classical music, especially like Studio Ghibli. Like I know like so many people like love Studio Ghibli, especially the soundtracks and like all of that. So I think that that's like a good like kind of bridge in between these like two different worlds. Yeah. So like on the topic of that, how do you think we can work to like make modern classical music more accessible to teens, especially in like the Seattle area?
That's a huge question, and I think it's hard to come up with one answer. I mean, the Seattle Symphony has a lot of they used to have like an instrument petting zoo, and something that I participated in, the Young Composers program, I think is a great opportunity. I mean, it's completely free for people to find their own voices in classical music and not play other people's music. I think that Young Composers Workshop is one of the best youth programs in the US, or maybe even the world. It's a great opportunity. And I'm starting to see more youth chamber programs. The Seattle Youth Symphony is also something that's been having a lot of people participate in classical music. But in terms of changing things, I think being able to utilize kind of a multifaceted approach, so that it's not just like summer programs, maybe leveraging like social media and streaming services would really kind of lead into what people are looking for right now.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay. That's all the questions I have for you. I'm sorry this was so short, but like, yeah. But yeah. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. Yeah, it was great to talk to you. This was the Teen Takes Arts podcast. Thank you for listening. We hope this episode will encourage you to check out some contemporary classical music and possibly change your mind about it. Thank you to our interviewees and everyone behind the scenes who helped make this happen, especially the Veer Project for the recording space, Ground Zero Radio for the help in producing Tap, and Totem Star recording artist Lily Indigo for the music you heard at the beginning of this episode. Join us next month when we talk about another artistic inspiration of one of the Tap hosts.